Welcome back, everybody. Ready to dive into Joshua with me today?
Always ready.
Awesome. Okay, so we're looking at chapter 13 today. And, I think when a lot of people think about Joshua, they think about, you know, the battles.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Conquering the land, the action.
Yeah, exactly. Jericho and all of that.
Exactly.
But chapter 13 is, it's a bit different.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at dividing up the land. So
Yeah.
kind of think of it like a giant ancient real estate deal.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to think about it. It's like God gave them this promise, and now they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we divide this up? How do we make sure everybody gets their fair share?
Yeah. And that's what I think is really interesting about this. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, there's the battles and there's the conquering, but then there's also this very practical, like, how do we make this work?
Yeah.
How do we actually live in this land that we've been given?
Yeah, and there's a lot of detail in this chapter about which tribe gets what and where the boundaries are.
Yeah, it's very specific.
Very specific.
Um, but what's interesting, too, is like even Joshua, this great leader, right?
Right.
He's done all this incredible stuff, but there's still this reminder at the beginning of the chapter that he's not done yet.
Yeah. God's like, hey, Joshua, there's still more to do, There's still land to be conquered.
Right.
It's kind of a reality check, isn't it? Even after all he's done, there's still work to be done.
And I love that because I think for so many of us, right, like we can look at our lives and think like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to finish all this stuff.
Yeah.
I still have so many goals and dreams and there's so much I want to accomplish.
Right, yeah.
And this is like God's reminding Joshua, like, it's okay. Like, you don't have to do everything at once.
Exactly.
Like just keep going one step at a time.
And I think what's even more remarkable is that God acknowledges that Joshua is getting older.
Yes. That's what really struck me too.
The text says he's stricken in years, and there's this sense of compassion from God. Like, hey, I know you're not a young man anymore, but I'm still with you.
Yes. Like, I see you've been working hard.
Yeah, I see your efforts. I see your faithfulness.
It's so encouraging, right?
Mm.
Because I think we can get so caught up in like feeling like we have to do it all perfectly or we have to do it all right now. And this is like a reminder that like God's grace is sufficient. He's with us every step of the way.
Absolutely.
So, okay, we've talked about, Joshua still having work to do. Let's actually get into like the details of how this land was divided up.
Okay.
Right. Because it's really specific.
Mm.
And like you said, it mentions which tribe gets what and where the boundaries are. It's like reading this ancient property deed.
And I think one of the most fascinating details is that one tribe doesn't get any land at all.
Oh, yeah. The Levites.
The Levites.
That's right.
They were the priestly tribe set apart for spiritual service.
Right. So their inheritance is different.
It's different. Their inheritance wasn't physical land or material possessions. It was God himself.
Whoa.
Yeah. It's like, what does that even mean?
Right. Yeah. Like, what does that look like? How do you inherit God?
Right. But I think there's a powerful truth there about different kinds of wealth and inheritance, like what truly matters in life. Is it about material possessions or is it about something deeper, more lasting?
Wow. Yeah. I never thought about it like that.
It makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
So we've got all these tribes, most of them getting land, but the Levites getting something different.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you wonder, like, what does that mean for us today? What's our inheritance?
It's a good question. And I think there are some parallels there for us to consider. Like, what are the things we value most? Are they physical possessions or are they things like relationships, purpose, spiritual growth?
I love that. So we're starting to see how this ancient story can really speak to our lives today. But before we get too far ahead, let's pause here and pick up this conversation in our next segment.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to diving deeper. It really is amazing how this story from thousands of years ago about dividing up land can still be so relevant today.
Right. Like
Yeah.
you wouldn't think it would be that interesting, but when you really dig in, there's a lot there.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the things that really struck me is this idea of thinking about the long term. The Israelites weren't just dividing up the land for themselves. They were thinking about future generations.
It was like a really big responsibility, right?
Yeah.
They had to think about how to sustain their families, their tribes for years to come.
Exactly. And I think there's a lesson there for us today. Like, it's easy to get caught up in the here and now, our immediate needs and wants, but we also need to think about the long-term impact of our choices, the legacy we're leaving behind.
So it's not just about like getting our piece of the pie right now. It's about making sure there's enough pie for everyone in the future too.
Exactly. Whether it's how we manage our finances, the decisions we make at work, or even how we raise our kids, we need to ask ourselves, what kind of foundation am I laying? What seeds am I planting for the future?
That's a powerful question. And it actually reminds me of something we were talking about earlier, with the Levites and
Yeah.
how they didn't receive any land.
Right. Their inheritance was different. It wasn't about physical
It was
possessions.
about God himself, which, I mean, that's a pretty big inheritance,
It is. And, it's easy to get caught up in the material things, to think that success is measured by what we own or how much money we have.
especially in today's world, right? There's so much pressure to have the latest gadgets, the biggest house, the fanciest car.
Yeah, it's easy to fall into that trap. But the Levites remind us that true fulfillment comes from something deeper, something more lasting.
It's like their inheritance wasn't something they could hold in their hands, but something that would sustain them from the inside out.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important message for us today. Like, what are the things that truly nourish our souls? What are the gifts and talents that we've been given that we can use to serve something greater than ourselves?
It's about finding our purpose
Right.
and not letting the comparison game steal our joy. We don't all have to be striving for the same things or measuring our worth by the same standards.
Absolutely. And speaking of striving, there's another important lesson in Joshua chapter 13 that I think we can all relate to.
Okay, tell me more.
It's this idea of trusting the process. Remember, the Israelites didn't conquer all of the promised land at once. There was still work to be done, even for Joshua.
Right, and God even reminds him of that at the beginning of the chapter.
Yeah, it's like, even the greatest leaders have to be patient, to trust that things will unfold in God's timing.
And we see that in our own lives too, don't we? Like,
Yeah.
we might have big goals and dreams, but sometimes it feels like they're so far off, maybe even impossible.
Right, and it's easy to get discouraged, to want to give up when we don't see immediate results.
But this chapter encourages us to have faith, to keep moving forward one step at a time, even when we don't know what the future holds.
Exactly. It's about embracing the journey, even with all its uncertainties and challenges. Because sometimes those challenges are what shape us, what prepare us for what lies ahead.
It's like those times when we're forced to wait, to be still, that's when we can really hear God's voice and discern his direction for our lives.
That's a good point. It's often in the quiet moments when we're not striving or rushing that we discover our true purpose.
And maybe, just maybe, that's when we start to understand what our own unique inheritance really is.
That's a great segue, because that brings us back to that big question we were talking about, What is our inheritance, not just in terms of material possessions, but in terms of the legacy we're leaving behind?
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? What does inheritance really mean?
All right.
Beyond just stuff, beyond money. It's like, what are we leaving behind? What's that impact?
Right. It's not just about what we accumulate, it's about what we contribute. Like, what mark are we making on the world? And I think it connects to that idea of each of us having a specific role to play, like those Israelite tribes.
I love that. Like, we each have our own piece of the puzzle. And maybe, just like the Levites, our most valuable inheritance isn't something tangible, but something we cultivate within ourselves, like our character, our faith, our values.
Exactly. Those things that shape who we are and how we interact with the world. And that reminds me of something you said earlier about how the Levites, even though they didn't have land, they weren't left out in the cold, the other tribes were instructed to provide for them.
Right, right. It really speaks to that sense of community. Like, we're all in this together. We're all interconnected. We're meant to support each other in living out our unique callings.
Absolutely. And, sometimes our inheritance isn't just about what we achieve individually, but about the impact we have on others, the ways we help them discover and fulfill their own potential.
So it's not just about personal success, but about contributing to something larger than ourselves, leaving the world a little bit better than we found it.
Exactly. That ripple effect, that's something that can truly last for generations. It's like planting a seed that grows into a tree that provides shade and fruit for others long after we're gone.
It's powerful, isn't it? That even in this ancient story about dividing up land, there's this timeless message about purpose, community, and the true meaning of inheritance.
It really is. And as we wrap up our dive into Joshua chapter 13, I think the biggest takeaway is this invitation to reflect on our own lives. What are we building? What kind of impact do we want to have? What is that unique inheritance that only we can bring to the world?
It's a challenge, for sure, to step away from that comparison game, to stop measuring ourselves against others, and to really lean into our own strengths and passions.
Because when we embrace our unique gifts and find joy in using them to serve others, that's when we truly come alive. And that, I believe, is the most precious inheritance of all.
Well, that wraps up our exploration of Joshua 13. I hope this deep dive has given you as much to think about as it has for us. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.